In this video, we're counting down the top 10 most influential U.S. presidents, the leaders whose impact still echoes across the nation and the world. Throughout American history, some presidents have led through war, others through peace. But which U.S. presidents truly left a mark that changed the course of history? Let's begin. At number 10, we have Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States. A former academic and governor of New Jersey, Wilson took office during a time of growing global unrest. But it was his leadership during World War I that would define his presidency. He pushed for neutrality at first, but later led the U.S. into the war, helping tilt the balance toward the Allies. After the conflict, Wilson proposed his bold vision for world peace, the 14 Points, and helped create the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations. Although the U.S. Senate rejected joining the League, Wilson's ideas influenced global diplomacy for decades. Domestically, he signed the Federal Reserve Act, which reshaped the American financial system and enacted major progressive reforms. Despite his influence, his legacy remains controversial. His support for segregation and civil liberties violations during wartime tarnish what might have been an unblemished record. Still, Wilson's vision of international cooperation and institutional reform left a mark that extended far beyond his presidency. Our number 9 is Lyndon B. Johnson, the 36th President of the United States. A man whose presidency was marked by historic progress at home and devastating consequences abroad. Johnson assumed office in the aftermath of tragedy, following the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. Many expected him to be a transitional figure. Instead, he became one of the most consequential domestic reformers in American history. Driven by his vision of a great society, Johnson launched a sweeping set of legislative initiatives aimed at eliminating poverty, advancing civil rights, and expanding government responsibility in health and education. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. Just a year later, he championed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, securing ballot access for millions of Black Americans. Johnson also created Medicare and Medicaid, bringing healthcare to the elderly and the poor, institutions that remain cornerstones of American social policy to this day. He invested heavily in education, urban renewal, and public broadcasting, believing the government could be a force for good in people's daily lives. But while Johnson's domestic legacy was groundbreaking, his foreign policy became his greatest liability. Under his leadership, U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War escalated rapidly. What began as limited support turned into a full-scale military commitment, with hundreds of thousands of American troops deployed overseas. The war dragged on, deeply dividing the nation. Protests erupted across college campuses. The credibility gap between the government and the public widened. And in 1968, battered by public opinion and political pressure, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. His presidency remains one of stark contrasts, a champion of civil rights and the poor at home, but a commander-in-chief presiding over one of the most unpopular wars in American history. At number 8, we have Thomas Jefferson, a founding father, the 3rd President of the United States, and the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson entered office in 1801, following a bitter and highly partisan election against John Adams. It marked the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties in American history, a defining moment for the country's democratic experiment. Philosophically rooted in Enlightenment ideals, Jefferson believed in individual liberty, states' rights, and a limited federal government. As president, he worked to reduce the national debt, eliminate internal taxes, and scale back military expenditures. His economic policies reflected a belief that the government should interfere as little as possible in the lives of its citizens. Yet Jefferson's presidency was also marked by one of the boldest moves in U.S. history, the Louisiana Purchase. In 1703, he acquired over 800,000 square miles of territory from France, effectively doubling the size of the United States. The purchase had no clear constitutional authorization, something Jefferson himself questioned, but it permanently reshaped the nation's geography and destiny. To explore this vast new land, Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark Expedition, a groundbreaking journey that charted a path to the Pacific and opened the door to westward expansion. However, not all of his decisions were successful. The Embargo Act of 1807, intended to punish Britain and France during the Napoleonic Wars, ended up crippling the American economy and provoked widespread backlash. It was one of his least popular policies. And then there's the enduring contradiction of Jefferson's life. A man who wrote that all men are created equal, yet enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime. His personal and political legacy is deeply intertwined with the institution of slavery, a stain that history continues to grapple with. Coming in at number 7 is Andrew Jackson, the 7th President of the United States and one of the most polarizing figures in American political history. A self-made man and war hero from the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson became the symbol of a new kind of American democracy, one that claimed to represent the common man instead of the elite. His presidency marked a decisive shift in political power away from the aristocracy and toward broader popular participation, ushering in what became known as the Jacksonian era. Jackson redefined the American presidency. He expanded the powers of the executive branch more than any of his predecessors, vetoing legislation with unprecedented frequency and asserting his will as the ultimate representative of the people. His populist style, aggressive rhetoric, and outsider status would inspire generations of political figures long after him. Among his most notable achievements was his battle against the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson viewed the bank as a corrupt institution that favored wealthy interests over ordinary citizens. His successful effort to dismantle it changed the American financial system, though it also sparked economic instability. Jackson also eliminated the national debt entirely during his tenure, the only U.S. president to ever do so, and he strengthened federal authority during the nullification crisis, confronting South Carolina's attempt to defy federal tariffs. But his legacy is darkened by his policy toward Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, which Jackson strongly advocated, led to the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans, most notoriously through the Trail of Tears, where thousands perished during the brutal journey west. This chapter of his presidency remains one of the most tragic and morally condemned actions in U.S. history. Loved by his supporters and reviled by his critics, Jackson created the modern presidency as a forceful, personal institution, but at an immense human and constitutional cost. At number 6, we find Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, and perhaps the most energetic and reformist figure to ever occupy the office. Thrust into the presidency after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901, Roosevelt was only 42 years old, the youngest president in American history at the time. But despite his youth, he brought a fierce intellect, progressive vision, and unmatched political will to the White House. Roosevelt redefined the role of the federal government in the modern age. He broke up powerful corporate monopolies under the Sherman Antitrust Act, earning his reputation as a trust buster. He believed that unchecked corporate power was a threat to democracy and used federal authority to ensure a fairer economic playing field for workers and consumers. His square deal domestic agenda aimed to balance the interests of business, labor, and the public. He dramatically strengthened labor protections, improved food and drug regulations, and expanded environmental conservation efforts, protecting over 230 million acres of public land, establishing national parks, forests, and wildlife refuges. Roosevelt was arguably the first president to place environmentalism at the core of American policy. On the global stage, Roosevelt transformed the U.S. into a formidable world power. He expanded the Navy and asserted American influence through what became known as big stick diplomacy, negotiating peacefully while maintaining a strong military threat. His involvement in negotiating the end of the Russo-Japanese War earned him the Nobel Peace Prize, making him the first American to receive it. However, Roosevelt's assertive foreign policy also drew criticism. His role in the Panama Canal's construction, which involved backing Panama's independence from Colombia, was seen by some as imperial overreach. Still, Roosevelt left office as one of the most popular presidents in history, and he continued to shape politics through his Progressive Party challenge in 1912. At number 5 is Dwight Eisenhower, the 34th President of the United States and one of the most consequential leaders of the post-World War II era. Before stepping into the Oval Office, Eisenhower had already secured his place in history as the supreme Allied commander during World War II. His leadership in the D-Day invasion made him a symbol of victory and stability, qualities that defined his presidency. Elected in 1952 during the early stages of the Cold War, Eisenhower brought a steady, pragmatic hand to the nation. He maintained a careful balance, confronting the Soviet Union with strength while avoiding direct military conflict. His doctrine of containment and reliance on nuclear deterrence helped define U.S. foreign policy for decades. But his legacy isn't only about geopolitics. At home, Eisenhower oversaw one of the most transformative infrastructure projects in American history: the creation of the interstate highway system. It revolutionized transportation, commerce, and the American way of life, fueling suburban growth and economic expansion. He also expanded Social Security, kept New Deal programs intact, and maintained fiscal responsibility. balancing the budget multiple times during his presidency. Yet Eisenhower's presidency wasn't without tension. He enforced the Supreme Court's ruling on Brown Board of Education by sending federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to protect black students integrating Central High School. Though initially reluctant to engage in civil rights, his intervention set a powerful precedent for federal enforcement of constitutional rights. As he left office, Eisenhower warned the nation about the rising influence of the military-industrial complex, a term he coined to describe the dangerous alliance between defense contractors and policymakers. It was a prophetic message that continues to resonate today. At number 4 is Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, and one of the most transformative political figures of the 20th century. A former Hollywood actor and California governor, Reagan entered the White House in 1981 with a bold promise: to restore American confidence, reduce the size of government, and confront the Soviet Union head-on. His presidency would go on to reshape not only U.S. domestic policy, but the global balance of power. Reagan's economic vision, often called Reaganomics, emphasized tax cuts, deregulation, and reduced government spending. Critics warned of increased deficits and inequality, but supporters credited it with sparking a period of sustained economic growth and renewed entrepreneurial spirit. His belief in the power of free markets reshaped conservative politics for decades to come. On the global stage, Reagan's approach to the Cold War was unapologetically aggressive. He increased military spending to unprecedented levels and described the Soviet Union as the evil empire. His strategic defense initiative, dubbed Star Wars, symbolized his willingness to challenge the Soviets technologically and ideologically. But Reagan wasn't just a hardliner. In his second term, he pivoted toward diplomacy, working closely with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to reduce nuclear stockpiles and ease tensions. The INF Treaty of 1987 marked a major step in ending the arms race. Just 2 years after he left office, the Berlin Wall fell, a symbolic victory often credited in part to Reagan's firm stance. Domestically, he survived an assassination attempt, reshaped the federal judiciary with conservative appointees, and led a powerful cultural realignment. Yet his administration was not without scandal. The Iran-Contra affair raised serious questions about executive overreach and foreign policy transparency. Reagan's legacy remains polarizing. To some, he is a champion of freedom and prosperity. To others, a symbol of growing inequality and unchecked power. But few deny the scale of his impact. At number 3 is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, and the only president elected to 4 terms. His leadership through 2 of the gravest crises in American history, the Great Depression and World War II, redefined the role of the federal government and the presidency itself. When Roosevelt took office in 1933, the country was in economic freefall. Banks were collapsing, unemployment had soared to 25%, and faith in American democracy was at risk. With calm confidence and sweeping action, Roosevelt launched the New Deal, a series of programs, reforms, and public works projects designed to stabilize the economy, provide relief, and prevent future collapses. He created Social Security, regulated Wall Street, insured bank deposits, and brought millions of unemployed Americans back to work through initiatives like the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration. His fireside chats, broadcast on radio, reconnected the presidency with the people, giving hope in a time of despair. But Roosevelt's leadership was tested again when the U.S. was thrust into World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Roosevelt swiftly mobilized the American economy into a war machine, forging alliances and directing a global military campaign against fascism. Under his leadership, the U.S. emerged not just victorious, but as a global superpower. At the same time, Roosevelt's administration was far from perfect. His decision to authorize the internment of Japanese Americans remains one of the most criticized actions of his presidency. Some of his New Deal programs disproportionately excluded Black Americans from full participation and benefits. Still, Roosevelt's vision of an active, responsive government, paired with his ability to communicate and inspire during crises, set a new standard for presidential leadership. He died in office in 1945, just months before the end of the war, leaving behind a transformed nation. In the second position stands Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, and a towering figure not just in American history, but in the history of democracy itself. When Lincoln took office in 1861, the nation was unraveling. 7 southern states had already seceded from the Union, and the Civil War was inevitable. A lesser leader might have accepted division. Lincoln chose to preserve the Union, not through compromise, but through conviction. He led the country through its bloodiest and most existential crisis with unmatched clarity, moral courage, and political skill. In doing so, he redefined what the United States stood for. His most transformative act came in 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared enslaved people in Confederate states free. Though limited in immediate effect, it shifted the war's purpose from preserving the Union to expanding freedom. It paved the way for the eventual abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment, which Lincoln championed until his final days. Lincoln's leadership extended beyond wartime decisions. He expanded the power of the presidency, managed a divided cabinet with brilliance, and used rhetoric as a weapon of unity. His speeches, from the Gettysburg Address to his second inaugural, remain masterpieces of moral clarity and political vision. Yet his presidency ended in tragedy. Just days after Union victory in 1865, Lincoln was assassinated, becoming the first U.S. president to die by murder. The nation mourned as one, and his death elevated him to martyrdom. To this day, Lincoln is revered as a symbol of unity, justice, and resilience. But he was also a shrewd political operator who evolved significantly in office, from cautious moderate to emancipator. At number 1 is George Washington, not just the first president of the United States, but the very foundation upon which the presidency itself was built. Before he ever took office, Washington was already a legend, the commander-in-chief who led a ragtag army to victory against the world's greatest military power, and the man who presided over the Constitutional Convention. But his most lasting legacy wasn't forged on the battlefield. It was forged in restraint. When the people called for him to become king, he refused. When others sought to hold power indefinitely, he stepped down. In an age of revolution and authoritarian backlash, Washington gave the world something rare. A victorious general who willingly surrendered power for the good of the Republic. As the first president, there were no precedents to follow, so he became the precedent. Washington shaped the office with dignity, humility, and deep responsibility. He refused to overreach, never abused his power, and believed that character was as essential to leadership as policy. He created the first cabinet, oversaw the Bill of Rights, and helped establish the federal judiciary. He remained neutral in European conflicts, keeping the young nation out of war. And in his farewell address, he warned of the dangers of partisanship, sectionalism, and foreign entanglements, advice that still echoes through the corridors of American politics. He served 2 terms and then stepped aside, not because he had to, but because he believed in something greater than himself. George Washington didn't just lead a nation, he gave it a conscience. He showed the world that democracy could survive, that power could be entrusted to the people, and that the presidency could serve the nation, not dominate it.